Congresswoman Crockett, you are fined $1,000 for disrespect. The gavel cracks. The sound echoes off the courtroom walls like a gunshot in a chapel. Shock ripples across the gallery. A journalist's pen halts mid-sentence. A low gasp rolls from the rows behind her. Phones, still recording, catch the faint sound of someone whispering. Did he really just say that? Jasmine Crockett doesn't blink. She sits tall, spine unmoving, lips pressed together, eyes locked in unwavering focus. Not a twitch of surprise, not a flicker of outrage, only stillness, deep and deliberate. Judge Andrew Napolitano, row pressed, mouth tight, leans back like he's delivered a final blow. His face is hard with authority, lined with years of courtroom control. To him, this looks like justice, order, lesson taught. But it doesn't land that clean. Because no one quite knows what just crossed the line. The tension had been building, questions met with calm defiance, procedural jabs met with quiet assertions of principle. But a fine? For what? Holding her ground? Choosing her words carefully? Standing her truth? There was no disruption, no shouting, no breaking of decorum. Only Jasmine's refusal to bow to tones meant to shrink her. The courtroom doesn't know what to do at this moment. Cameras keep rolling, eyes dart from one bench to the next. Were they watching a legal decision or a political punishment dressed in a robe? And then a shift. Jasmine leans forward gently. Her hands stay folded, her voice doesn't rise. She hasn't said a word yet, but everything about her calm says she will. She will answer the fine. She will answer the accusation, and she will do it not with apology, but with truth, not loud, not shaken, but ready. And what she's about to say will reshape everything that comes after. 6 weeks before the gavel struck, the hearing wasn't even supposed to make headlines. It was scheduled as a routine oversight session, an inquiry into judicial conduct, transparency, and procedural reform. But once Jasmine Crockett's name landed on the witness list, it turned into something else entirely. Because there's rarely anything routine when a progressive Black congresswoman walks into an institution that was never built to make space for her voice. Judge Andrew Napolitano was tapped to preside over the session by a special panel, an unusual move some saw as symbolic, others as strategic. With decades of courtroom experience and a long second life as a cable news commentator, he was the establishment's favorite kind of figure. Sharply spoken, draped in legal gravitas, but always ready to entertain. He arrived not just as a judge, but as a persona smirking through questions, slow to interrupt men who rambled, quick to rein in women who dared to speak with precision. And Jasmine? She came in armed with facts, case precedents, and community voices echoing through her every line of questioning. Their clash didn't begin with the fine. It began with friction. From the outset, Jasmine insisted on naming inconvenient truths, how loopholes in the judicial system hurt Black and brown communities, how procedural delay often masked institutional evasion. She wasn't theatrical. She was deliberate, controlled, unwilling to let old power dictate new narratives. Napolitano bristled. The more Jasmine spoke, the more he interrupted. First lightly, then more forcefully. He accused her of straying off topic, of making it personal, of getting emotional, a word loaded with centuries of silencing behind it. She responded each time with clarity, never once raising her voice. But courtroom tradition doesn't always welcome truth if it doesn't come packaged in reverence. And that's why the fine mattered. It wasn't about a number. It was about a message, punishment, not for breaking the rules, but for refusing to bend to them. To those watching on the live stream, especially communities that have seen judges double as gatekeepers of silence. This wasn't just a disrespect fine. It was a warning. Don't speak too boldly. Don't question too sharply. Don't belong too confidently. But Jasmine never came to blend in. She came to speak for those who can't afford contempt charges, for those who don't get second chances when they speak out of turn, for those who are told that critique is criminal if it comes without deference. That's why this moment exploded beyond the chamber, because for millions of viewers, it wasn't just about a courtroom. It was about every room where they'd been talked over, penalized, or pushed out for the simple act of defending their voice. And now, with the fine imposed and the silence settling, the stakes couldn't be clearer. This isn't just about her response. It's about whether dignity can still speak in a room trying to price it out. Judge Andrew Napolitano didn't walk into the courtroom that day as a blank slate. He walked in carrying decades of applause, controversy, and carefully cultivated confidence. To mainstream America, he was many things retired: superior court judge, best-selling author, fiery libertarian voice, and once the only cable news personality who could spout constitutional law like it was slam poetry. On air, he branded himself a champion of free speech, a warrior against government overreach, a relentless voice for civil liberties. But scratch beneath the surface, and another pattern reveals itself. Napolitano's brand of truth was often packaged with asterisks. His outrage typically flared in one direction. Freedom was a word he championed, but only for those who kept their grievances polite, their tone manageable, and their identities digestible. When protests erupted in America's streets calling for racial justice, Napolitano went on air, not to uplift the right to dissent, but to scold those who disrespected institutions. When young activists demanded systemic change, he reminded viewers that law and order must come first. And when women, especially women of color, spoke forcefully in public arenas, it was often Napolitano who questioned their decorum, their tone, their judicial temperament. His gavel, once a symbol of neutral process, had become a stage prop, part of a performance where control was everything, but accountability ran thin. In more conservative circles, he was adored for it. The robe, the rhetoric, the righteous certainty made him a hero to those who believed the system worked just fine, so long as the right people were in charge of it. But for those on the other side of that gavel, advocates, upstart legislators, and weary defendants alike, Napolitano's courtroom had another reputation. One where lines were drawn early and respect flowed in one direction, where questions that touched raw truths were dismissed as grandstanding, where order mattered more than outcome. Even in retirement, his name kept rising. Networks called for his takes, committees asked him to moderate, and eventually, the special hearing, one designed to showcase the judiciary's willingness to engage with reform, chose him to preside. They said it would lend gravitas, predictability, experience, but what they got was a walking contradiction, because here he was, the so-called free speech purist, interrupting a sitting Congresswoman mid-thought for her tone, the self-declared guardian of liberty, shutting down discussion when it veered into uncomfortable territory, the former judge who told camera crews he believed in transparency but fined a lawmaker in real time for doing exactly what they were elected to do: speak for the people who sent them. To some, it was just a slip, a judge losing patience. But to millions watching, it felt too familiar, because it wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about every time the rules have been used to keep certain people in their place. People remember all the times decorum became a disguise for power. How peaceful protest becomes threatening when it comes from black voices. How criticism becomes disorderly when it challenges white authority. How a word like disrespect gets weaponized, not based on what's said, but on who dares to say it. And in that courtroom, Napolitano played that script to the letter. What began as judicial formality quickly turned into something sharper. He questioned Jasmine's intentions. He framed her insistence on facts as personal opinion. And when she refused to soften for the sake of his comfort, he reached for the final lever, the fine. It wasn't about the money. It never is. It was about the message. $1,000, not as restitution, but as retribution. A line drawn in real time. How dare you challenge me, on my turf, under my rules? In that gesture, Napolitano exposed more than any transcript could. He showed what happens when tradition forgets its purpose and becomes a shield for ego. He showed what a gavel sounds like when it's not calling the room to order, but silencing the one person it no longer knows how to control. And while he may have thought that moment cemented his power, what happened next would prove how quickly the ground underneath the legacy can shift. Because this time, the one being silenced didn't fold. She answered with truth, calmly, fearlessly, and once the world heard what she had to say, the image of the judge was no longer untouchable. It was visible. and vulnerable. To understand why Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch when Judge Napolitano fined her, you have to understand where she came from and how many rooms she's already walked into knowing she was not meant to feel welcome. Before the cameras, before span clips went viral, before she became the name whispered to Capitol Hill corridors with equal parts admiration and apprehension, Jasmine Crockett was a frontline attorney in Texas. Not the kind that shows up late with a latte and flashes credentials. The kind that stayed in the trenches. Back then, her clients didn't bring her billable hours. They brought her stories scarred with injustice. Families evicted. Workers fired for speaking up. Protesters jailed for demanding dignity. They walked into overcrowded courtrooms with heads down, already convinced they wouldn't be heard. And Jasmine made it her mission to change that, case by case. She wasn't loud. She was relentless. She knew the law, but more importantly, she knew how it was used and misused, depending on who stood in front of the bench. So she did the work others avoided. She took cases that wouldn't pay, committed to truth that wouldn't trend. When police reports didn't match the footage, she dug deeper. When prosecutors overcharged to scare defendants into silence, she pushed back. It was never about proving she was the smartest in the room. It was about making sure power didn't go unchecked, no matter who wore the robe or held the mic. And just when people began to notice her in the courthouse, she did something few expected. She ran for office. The Texas House wasn't a natural fit. It was a place where decorum often served as a muzzle, where legacy legislators knew each trick to keep newcomers quiet. But Jasmine didn't arrive trying to blend in. She arrived carrying every story her clients had ever trusted her with. The first time she spoke on the floor, some rolled their eyes. Others smirked. The unspoken message was clear. Wait your turn. She didn't. She forced debates on bills that others tried to rush. She named systemic loopholes with such clarity that even those trying to ignore her were forced to react. She was called disruptive, radical, unprofessional, all code words for someone too grounded to be shaken. But every time they tried to box her in, she expanded the room. Cameras picked up clips of her silencing bad faith interrogations with nothing but law and logic. Her following grew not because she chased attention, but because she made people feel like they were finally being represented completely. People saw someone who didn't water down their experiences just to be allowed at the table. Eventually, she made the leap to Congress. And sure, the suits got more expensive, the microphones more permanent, but the tactics aimed at silencing her, they stayed the same. Interruptions, mispronounced names, strategic delays, backroom whispers wondering if she was too aggressive, too blunt, too emotional, especially when she was the only one in the room quoting legal code word for word. But she kept coming back to one thing, her purpose. She hadn't come to Washington to make anyone comfortable. She came to make the system honest, and that meant saying things aloud that others avoided, whether it was about race, policing, housing inequality, or judicial bias. So when she sat in that courtroom under Napolitano's glare, it wasn't her first rodeo with ego dressed as order. She'd already stood in front of judges who talked over her, already debated lawmakers who dismissed her before she spoke, already heard the word disrespect used like a sword to cut down every woman who didn't smile while being silenced. To the public, that fine was a scandal. To Jasmine, it was repetition with a new set design. She didn't respond with rage because it wasn't new. She didn't weep because the insult didn't land the way Napolitano thought it would. She'd felt worse, heard sharper, fought harder battles in rooms with no press, no backup, and no obvious win. What he read as audacity, she carried as memory. That's why the moment mattered, not because it shocked her, but because it revealed her consistency. Jasmine Crockett has always spoken in places designed to ignore her voice. She spoke at court benches designed to fast-track convictions. She spoke on House floors designed to protect fragile egos. She spoke in committee rooms packed with people waiting to cut her mic. And she always spoke not out of vanity, but out of duty to the people who don't get invited into those rooms at all. By the time Judge Napolitano fined her, she didn't need a reminder that systems punish the wrong kind of boldness. She'd lived it, but what he didn't realize was this. Every silencing leaves an echo, and every echo builds a deeper resolve. Jasmine Crockett didn't just come prepared with facts, she came armored with experience. So when she finally leaned forward to speak, it wasn't to defend her ego. It was to represent every single soul who'd been told that speaking honestly and speaking respectfully couldn't be the same thing if you looked like her. And in that moment, every pause, every word, every beat of her breath carried the weight of all the rooms she'd spoken in before and the millions of people still waiting to be heard. It didn't start with shouting. It started with framing. The courtroom was barely settling into rhythm when Jasmine asked her first pointed question, not with malice, but with clarity sharpened by years of practice. Judge Napolitano, could you clarify how this panel defines impartiality when structural bias is excluded from the docket altogether? It was precise, controlled, and unmistakably uncomfortable. Napolitano adjusted his glasses. He shifted in his seat, not because it was a violation of protocol, but because it struck at the performance of neutrality, the one thing his reputation quietly depended on. He answered curtly, pivoting toward technical definitions, sidestepping the deeper point. Jasmine didn't blink. Moments later, she pushed again. I just want to confirm, is this committee truly open to critique when correction has already been labeled as disruptive? The room tightened. The observers leaned in. This wasn't grandstanding. It was a masterclass in calling out baked-in assumptions with a smile and a citation. But Napolitano's patience began to fray. That's not appropriate, Congresswoman, he snapped, cutting her off mid-sentence. She paused, waited, and resumed. Respectfully, I was not finished, and the record should reflect that. He tried again. Let's stay within the scope of this hearing. She replied, still steady. I believe I am. If the scope includes the rights of citizens beneath the bench, not just those behind it. The interruption. Count grew. 3 times, then 5. Each time, Jasmine let him speak. Each time, she resumed exactly where she left off. She did not raise her voice. She did not apologize for pressing on, but that's what made it worse for him. She refused to bend, not loudly, not rudely, but firmly. Napolitano's tone shifted from clipped to condescending. Perhaps you're unfamiliar with how courtrooms function, Congresswoman. Jasmine smiled coolly. On the contrary, Judge, I'm too familiar. The air crackled, and that's when he reached for it, not logic, not rebuttal, but authority. I am fining you $1,000 for conduct inconsistent with the decorum of this proceeding. The words landed like bricks. A rustle shot through the gallery. People looked around to confirm they'd heard right. The court reporter paused instinctively. The federal seal behind the bench loomed heavy overhead. But Jasmine? She didn't move, not because she wasn't affected, but because she refused to give him the satisfaction of flinching. The weight of the fine tried to crush her presence into submission. It failed. She kept her posture, met his eyes, allowed the silence to linger. Because beneath her calm composure was something roiling and electric, something his gavel hadn't accounted for. Dignity, not the cheapened version handed out to congressional guests who play nice, but the kind that has been tested and tried on courthouse floors stained with history, in rooms where power comes wrapped in faux respect. She knew what this was. It wasn't about rules. It was about control, and this was a final attempt to reassert it. But Jasmine had seen control take this shape before, and she'd learned the most effective weapon wasn't volume. It was refusing to disappear. As the fine echoed through the chambers like a final act, Jasmine leaned forward slowly, pausing, letting every eye land on her, and without saying a word, she reminded the room, if they expected silence in exchange for consequence, they'd chosen the wrong woman. Jasmine Crockett exhales once. Quietly, the fine still hangs in the air like the final insult at a party that forgot who it invited. She doesn't deny it happened. She doesn't flinch from its weight. She carries it, and then, with every camera trained on her and every heartbeat in the room held in suspense, she leans toward the microphone, not just to speak, but to reclaim. If I may respond, Your Honor, she says, calm and level, no trace of theatrics in her voice, just control tight, deliberate, and armed to the teeth. Napolitano says nothing. He gestures stiffly, permitting her to speak. But the dynamic has already shifted. The gavel may be his, but the room now belongs to her. I want the record to show that I came here today in good faith to contribute to a hearing that claims to examine transparency and justice. But what I've experienced in this courtroom reflects what so many Americans already know, that the very act of speaking truth, plainly and respectfully, is too often treated like an offense. Her voice doesn't tremble, it doesn't spike. It glides through the space with a clarity the cameras can't look away from. I was fined $1,000, she continues, not for disrupting this courtroom, but for refusing to dilute my words, for refusing to twist my tone into something more palatable, for doing what every person in my district has asked me to do, speak for people who are consistently ignored, misunderstood, or silenced by this very system. The courtroom is silent, not the stiff, procedural silence imposed from the bench, but the kind that blooms when something undeniable is unfolding. I did not insult anyone, she says. I did not shout. I did not storm out. I asked questions on the record about fairness, bias, and the patterns we see over and over again. If that constitutes disrespect, then the definition is broken. Napolitano shifts in his chair now, visibly uneasy. The confidence that once coded every ruling begins to crack beneath the pressure of her composure. Jasmine continues, uninterrupted. Let me be clear, this fine does not affect me alone. I'll pay that $1,000 and not flinch. But I represent people for whom that same amount would mean rent, groceries, survival. And too many of those people have had interactions with courtrooms where the message was the same. Speak softly, defer quickly, or be punished. The audience beyond the glass can't believe what they're watching. And social media is already ablaze, capturing clips mid-sentence, captioning her in real time with phrases like, "Speak, Queen." And this is how you own a courtroom. We cannot claim to value justice, she says, when we penalize critique and protect fragility. We cannot preach transparency when power bristles every time someone holds up a mirror. She looks around the room, deliberately slow. Her gaze does not dart. It fixes on faces, on systems, on history. And I'm especially disappointed, Judge, she adds, because you built a public persona on principles of liberty, of protecting rights, of championing free speech. But what I've seen today is not liberty. It's a performance of order timed perfectly to protect ego. A low murmur ripples through the space. That's the thing about respect. Can't be demanded by robe or gavel. It has to be earned and maintained by how we treat the voices pushed furthest to the margins. Napolitano opens his mouth slightly, but decides against speaking. Jasmine leaves no space to interrupt. You think this changes me? It doesn't. What happened today is not new to me. I've been penalized for speaking full sentences since I was a child, interrupted on debate stages, discredited in courtrooms, doubted in legislatures. Every space I enter, I've had to prove I deserve to be there. Twice. She raises her hand slightly and places it flat on the desk before her. But each time they've tried to make me smaller, I've grown further into my purpose. I've learned how to turn attempts to silence me into platforms that cannot be ignored. And this moment, this fine, you just gave me the loudest mic I've ever had. Every person in the gallery is still. Every person online is quoting her. And Jasmine knows it. So go ahead, she says. Keep the fine on record. Stamp it, file it, celebrate it if you must. But understand this. All you've done is remind the people I represent that even when we play by every rule, we still get punished for existing too boldly. She leans back slightly, letting the words breathe. And now, thanks to you, millions more will understand exactly what it looks like when dignity speaks and privilege calls it disrespect. The silence that follows isn't awkward, it's reverent. Because she didn't come to win a point. She came to deliver a clarity. No bench, no robe, no title could mute. Napolitano reaches for his papers, suddenly unsure of where the hearing even left off. The room hasn't moved, but the power inside it has. And Jasmine? She doesn't gloat. She doesn't smile. But in her stillness, there is something unmistakable. Fire contained, not extinguished. She didn't react with rage. She responded with reality, with every word rooted in lived experience, every sentence mirroring a truth the courtroom could not contain. And as the press scrambles to post, as hashtags flood timelines, and as the hearing teeters on collapse beneath the weight of what just happened, one thing becomes clear. They fined her for speaking, and she turned it into a movement. It didn't take a full hour. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett finishing her mic drop response, the internet caught fire. Clips of her calmly dismantling Napolitano's authority were everywhere. 10 seconds of video turned into 20 threads. Then memes. Then stitched TikToks narrated by people who looked like her, who lived moments just like hers with fewer microphones and greater consequences. Number Find Me Then wasn't a joke. It was an anthem. It started with a single post, a college student quoting Jasmine's line, "You gave me the loudest mic I've ever had," paired with her own story about being suspended for challenging a curriculum that didn't reflect her heritage. Then came teachers, nurses, activists, pastors. A black woman in Kansas wrote, "Judge thought he ended the conversation. Sis turned it into a syllabus." Another followed, "They always tell us to speak up until we do." Number Find Methane trended number 1 for 12 hours straight. Cable networks scrambled to find context, but social media already knew what it had witnessed. Jasmine's takedown wasn't just powerful, it was familiar, and the people who knew the weight of that fine understood immediately what was at stake. Civil rights organizations issued statements within the day, calling the fine a punitive overreach and a textbook demonstration of institutional fragility hiding behind protocol. For black women, in politics, it was another confirmation of what they've always known, that your tone will be policed, your questions viewed as threats, and your mere presence as an irritant to fragile systems built without you in mind. But this time, someone stood still and told the truth in public. The thing about Crockett's moment wasn't that it was new. It was just that it was recorded, shared, validated. People could see it wasn't hysteria or a rant. It was poise, truth, and the refusal to make her fight more palatable. It reached people who'd never heard of her before. Casual viewers, suburban moms, immigrants who didn't follow U.S. politics closely, but knew exactly what it looked like to be punished for disrespect that was just honesty. By day 2, high school students were reproducing the hearing in government class. One kid in Philadelphia recreated the exchange and ended with, "And systems can't handle your truth. They call it disrespect." The clip made its way to morning shows, pundits parsing every pause. Jasmine took, contrasting it with Napolitano's tightening face, his silence afterward. Late-night comedians called it the calmest explosion on record. Celebrities posted the speech under headlines like, "This is what accountability sounds like." And then came the split. Napolitano loyalists tried to spin, said Jasmine had disrespected the bench, made the hearing about herself, violated the sanctity of the proceeding. But the echoes didn't register, because behind their words was the deeper fear. She had exposed what happens when power tries to draw a line and gets met with clarity instead of cowering. Even his legal peers disagreed, some on record. A retired circuit judge tweeted, "You don't get to use a gavel as a muzzle." She spoke. He flinched. That's on him. In Congress, the ripple effect moved quickly. Members of the Progressive Caucus issued support. Crockett reminded us why we sent her there, read one message. Others went further, introducing a symbolic resolution condemning judicial overreach in congressional hearings. Down-ballot candidates started invoking her name. If Jasmine can hold a courtroom with her poise, one city council candidate whispered into a handheld mic at a campaign event, then we can sure as hell claim our entire damn seat. But the deepest impact was quieter. Messages flooded Jasmine's office, not from influencers, from people. A woman who'd been fired for asking her boss not to interrupt her, a first-generation college student who was mocked for her accent during presentations. A public defender who said she'd replay Jasmine's clip before every hearing from now on, and through it all, Jasmine said nothing else. She didn't ride the media wave. She didn't tour the networks. She let the moment speak, because it already had. The fine was supposed to end the conversation, but it triggered one. The nation still isn't ready to close. The aftermath wasn't chaos. It was clarity. When power punishes dignity, Truth gets louder. This wasn't just a confrontation between a congresswoman and a judge. It was a collision between two Americas. In one America, tradition is treated as sacred, even when it's weaponized. Systems built before certain people had the right to vote are still held up as beyond criticism. In this version of America, power asks for silence, calls it respect, and punishes anything louder than a nod. In the other America, the one rising, expanding, and finally being heard, respect isn't a one-way street. It isn't given because you wear a black robe or sit behind a desk. It's earned through action, through fairness, through listening when the people most often ignored finally take the mic. Judge Napolitano demanded respect, the procedural kind, the kind cloaked in phrases like decorum and civility. What he didn't expect was to be asked for accountability in return. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't storm out. She didn't perform. She stayed steady. In doing so, she made something crystal clear. Disagreement isn't disrespect. Passion isn't chaos. And truth, when spoken from the margins, doesn't need to ask permission to exist. By fining her, Napolitano thought he was delivering an ending. What he actually gave Jasmine was a platform. What he gave the movement behind her was a spark. What he gave the country was a mirror, because that moment her speech, her stillness, wasn't for him. It was for the people who have lived their whole lives trying to speak without being punished for the sound of their voice, for the people who've been told they're too angry when they're focused, too emotional when they're honest, too much when they're finally ready. That's what made this more than a courtroom dispute. It was a reminder that justice isn't just what the law says, it's how the law feels when it lands. And when it lands harder on the people already holding the most weight, someone has to call it out. Jasmine did. With clarity, not chaos. With poise, not platitudes. And through it, she forced the country to ask an uncomfortable question. What does it cost to speak truthfully in spaces never meant to hold your truth? For generations, that cost has been exile or erasure. For Jasmine, it was $1,000. But what she showed is that no fine, no title, no tradition is strong enough to bury a voice rooted in community. Her dignity wasn't broken by the penalty. It was amplified in spite of it. And for every person watching who had once clutched their words, revised their tone, or swallowed their truth just to be tolerated, this moment said, you are not alone. And when you finally speak, speak fully. Because silence hasn't saved us. Deference hasn't protected us. But courage, spoken plainly, that still has the power to shift the room. This wasn't the end of a failure in decorum. It was the start of a new standard. Not where respect is demanded with titles, but earned with truth. Not where protest is punished by paper but answered by power that listens. This was never about the dollars. It was always about the value of a voice not willing to shrink. Jasmine Crockett was fined $1,000 for disrespect. But the world didn't see disrespect. The world saw strength. They saw clarity in the face of control, calm in the face of condescension. They saw a black woman stand her ground not to impress, not to perform, but to protect the people who sent her there. This moment wasn't supposed to matter. Judge Napolitano expected it to end with silence. Instead, it sparked a nationwide echo. Because Jasmine didn't just pay the fine. She transformed it into a spotlight. She turned a courtroom tactic into a cultural reckoning. She gave voice to everyone who's ever been told to sit down, smile, and speak only when spoken to. So now, it's our turn. If this moment moved you, if you felt something watching her hold the line, don't let it stop here. Drop a comment with the last time you stood up for yourself or wished you had. Share this video with someone who needs to see what resolve really looks like. Support leaders who speak truth even when the system tries to fine them into silence. And if you're ready for more stories that call out injustice, spotlight courage, and remind every overlooked voice that they were never alone, subscribe now. Stay connected. Stay bold. Because the next time someone mislabels truth as disrespect, we want them to know we're louder, we're prouder, and we're not backing down.